Thelma and Louise. Waitress Louise Sawyer calls friend Thelma Dickinson to say they're leaving that night. Thelma should tell controlling husband Darryl she's going away with Louise. Louise leaves work in her green 1966 Thunderbird convertible. Thelma appears outside her house with lots of luggage, eagerly justifying it all. Louise smiles and takes a selfie of them both. On the road, Louise asks why Thelma brought a gun. Thelma says psycho killers, bears, snakes, confessing that she doesn't know how to use it. They're headed to Bob, the day manager's place in the mountains. Thelma and Louise find a busy truck stop, where Thelma immediately orders a wild turkey and a Coke. Louise soon orders a margarita and a shot of Cuervo. Redneck local Harlan Puckett starts chatting the women up. Louise discourages his attempts and he leaves. Then waitress Lena brings them fresh drinks sent over from Harlan. Thelma agrees to dance with him, but Louise says they're leaving soon. Thelma tells Harlan to stop spinning her. She feels sick. Harlan decides Thelma needs some air and briskly walks her outside. Harlan calls Thelma darling, grabbing her and lifting her onto a car. She tells him to let her go. Harlan slaps her in the face and says he won't hurt her. Thelma slaps Harlan, but he hits her twice in the face and forcibly lifts her dress. She begs for mercy, but Harlan only removes his belt. Louise appears and tells Harlan to release Thelma, soon pushing the handgun into Harlan's head. Harlan says they were just having a little fun. Louise says when a woman's whimpering like that, she's not having fun. Harlan further insults the women, so Louise fatally shoots him. At a roadside, Louise throws up. Nobody saw the killing, so nobody knows it was them. Louise calls boyfriend Jimmy, saying she's in deep trouble, and asks if he can wire her life savings of $6,700, promising to reimburse him. Louise tells Thelma they're going to Oklahoma City. Apparently, Darryl's been calling, angry as a hornet. Thelma says she should be the angry one. Nonetheless, Louise says in 2.5 days they'll be in Mexico. Thelma buys dozens of alcohol miniatures. She calls home and Darryl tells her to return immediately. Thelma insults him and hangs up. She then meets young cowboy J.D. and they exchange pleasantries. Thelma alone reapplies her makeup. J.D. politely asks her for a ride. Louise arrives and says it's not a good idea. On the road, Thelma swigs from a miniature and asks how long before they're in Mexico. Louise makes Thelma find all the secondary roads to Mexico from Oklahoma City, staying off the interstate and specifically avoiding Texas. Thelma and Louise give JD a ride anyway. JD discovers Thelma was 18 when she married Darryl, and that she's never been with anyone else. Louise goes to collect the money order. Jimmy appears in person and puts another motel room on his credit card. Louise hands the valuable stuffed envelope to Thelma for safekeeping. Alone, Jimmy casually proposes to Louise. She asks him why, and why then. Jimmy says he thinks maybe Louise doesn't love him anymore. Louise says she does, but it's time to let go. JD shows at Thelma's door, and soon he's topless, making her remove her wedding ring. Thelma asks who he is. He says he robbed some places. Thelma chuckles, then asks how. JD says he picks his place, then waits. Then he goes in, reels off his polite speech, and gets the hell out of Dodge. Thelma's impressed by his gentlemanly approach. JD says armed robbery doesn't have to be unpleasant. Next day, Thelma's unkempt. She tells Louise JD came back and she finally understands what all the fuss is about. Louise is happy Thelma finally got laid properly. They then discover that JD robbed them. Daryl lets the police into his house and they tap his phone. If Thelma calls, Daryl's told to play innocent. The police need to locate the women. Uncharacteristically, Thelma holds up a truck stop. She arrives quickly back at the car, telling Louise to drive, climbing in and shouting go. Louise can't believe Thelma robbed the store. Thelma says it was like she'd been robbing all her life. Louise says Thelma's disturbed. Thelma agrees, swigging from a miniature. Louise wants Thelma to call Daryl to see if he knows anything. If Thelma suspects he does, she should hang up immediately. The phone's likely been tapped. FBI agent Max asks JD where he got the $6,600. JD says a friend. Arkansas State Policeman Hal Slocum says someone delivered close to that amount to Louise Sawyer and asks if JD knows her. Max asks JD if he's aware Mrs. Dickinson and Miss Sawyer are wanted in connection with a murder. JD says they did seem jumpy. Hal asks if JD thinks Thelma would have committed armed robbery if JD hadn't taken all their money. Hal soon becomes irritated with JD and bashes him over the head with JD's own hat. Hal promises to hold JD responsible if anything happens to the women. Thelma and Louise pull up at a petrol station. Louise says if Thelma suspects Harlan knows, she should hang up. Daryl answers the phone and eagerly shouts hello to Thelma, who hangs up. Louise calls Daryl back, asking to talk to the person in charge. Hal gives his name. He tells Louise she and Thelma are wanted for questioning, and Miss Dickinson is wanted for armed robbery. Hal doesn't think they'll make it to Mexico. Louise hangs up. Louise asks Thelma how they know the women are going to Mexico. Thelma thought JD wouldn't tell anybody, then apologizes. Louise tells a sobbing Thelma not to talk to people. They're fugitives now. Thelma asks if Louise was raped in Texas. Louise stops the car and says she's not going to talk about that. Louise drives on silently as Thelma apologizes. Louise is pulled over by a cop. He says she's in a lot of trouble and makes a call on his radio. Thelma produces the gun and politely tells the officer to put his hands on the steering wheel. Thelma says they're wanted in 2 states and probably considered armed and dangerous. She tells Louise to take the cop's gun and destroy the police radio. Thelma orders the cop into the boot of his own car, and Louise should get the keys. Thelma shoots air holes in the car and makes him get in. Louise takes the cop's belt for the extra ammo. Thelma locks him in and tosses the keys away. Speeding off, Thelma says she feels like she has a knack for robbing. Both women reload, Louise saying drive like hell. Louise calls Daryl's house, asking to speak to Slocum. Louise says it was all an accident. Hal understands, but he'll have to charge the women with murder. One of the cops tapping the phone says they've got the women's location. Thelma tells Louise something's crossed over in her and she can't go back to regular life. Louise understands. Now they must decide if they want to come in dead or alive. Thelma doesn't remember feeling so awake. Everything looks different. They see a rude trucker up ahead. He flickers his tongue and makes suggestive comments. Louise tells him to follow them and drives off-road. He hurriedly removes his wedding ring and does a little jig as he eagerly runs over to the women. Thelma says they think he has really bad manners, but he refuses to apologize. Louise holds him at gunpoint and says he should say he's sorry, or, in the strongest terms, she'll make him sorry. She shoots out his truck's tires. With still no apology, Thelma and Louise both fire upon the truck till it explodes. Louise drives around and Thelma grabs his cap from the floor, leaving him angry and stranded. A Rastafarian cyclist finds the cop locked in his car. The cop calls out and points his finger through an air hole in the direction of the keys. The Rastafarian only blows weed smoke in through the hole. Louise sees police cars behind them, then asks if Thelma has her seatbelt on. Thelma says she's glad she came with Louise. Louise drives through a police roadblock and leads the remaining cops out across desert. With 11 police cars following, the women agree everything will be rubbish and unbearable moving forward. Thelma says there's nothing left to lose. A following police car is trapped under a low bridge, and more cars are blocked from pursuing. A police helicopter with Hal and Max on board appears facing the women. Louise sees the Grand Canyon ahead and brakes hard. Police officers by their cars sight both women. Thelma says it looks like the army. Hal tells Max not to shoot the women. Max says the women are armed. Thelma and Louise are told to turn off their engine and place their hands in plain view. Louise says she's not giving up. Hal asks how many times must the women be let down. The police repeat their commands. Thelma tells Louise they should keep going. Thelma looks at the canyon and says go. Louise smiles and asks if Thelma's sure. Thelma says yeah. Louise reaches over and kisses Thelma. Thelma and Louise launch into the canyon, clasping hands. Starring Susan Sarandon, Geena Davis, Harvey Keitel, rated 15, directed by Ridley Scott, released in the UK 1991, runtime 2 hours 50.